Our next speaker is Alex Hornstein. For the past 20 years, Alex has worked as an independent inventor, creating new ideas and getting them out into the world. When he's not in the lab or behind a lens, you can find him on the tops of mountains or the bottom of the ocean. I had the pleasure of meeting Alex at our New York workshop earlier this year, and I'm excited to announce his talk. Sorry. His talk is called Take a Deep Breath, a story of ventilator alchemy under pressure. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you. Let's see. All right, folks. How's everyone doing? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Whew. Well, I just flew in from Manila last night, and boy, are my arms tired. All right. So we're going to talk about ventilators. And this, of course, is something that comes during COVID. This is a complex topic. And so I'm going to try to split it to about half human stuff and half lungs, and everything in between. So before we get into it, I want to just give a note of introduction for myself and the sort of work that I do. So I find that the projects I work on tend to shift decade by decade by decade. And for about 10 years, I spent my 20s building rural electrification devices, working at the edge of the grid and putting solar systems in where there was no electricity. And this is a typical portrait of what this work looks like. A lot of climbing into rafters and putting stuff into corrugated steel roofs and what have you. I really liked this work for two particular reasons. So one is that this is kind of a classical application of technology where it makes a difference in people's lives. And it's a combination of, the work that I trained and studied and practiced to do in electrical engineering and computer science. And at the same time, it's an exercise in fighting against entropy, where there's a million reasons why this intervention you're trying to do shouldn't work. And it's kind of a battle of will and of connecting and bringing people together to try to push against entropy to make this thing that doesn't really want to exist. A house that is way up on top of a mountain or across several miles of ocean doesn't want to be connected to a perpetual source of electricity. And there's lots of things like typhoons and saltwater and landslides that tries to keep that from happening. So it's this constant battle against things that are trying to keep your idea from working. And of course, I could stay here and go work for General Electric and build, power line transformers, and there's no huge battle against entropy. Someone has taken care of that. But I liked this idea where no one has taken care of that. You can choose to make this intervention or not. And I like this one because you can see the results. And also, it's not boring. I actually really like this. In fact, a lot of the issues that come up are human obstacles to progress. This was one example of electrification we did in a village on top of Mount Makiling in the Philippines. And this village was not electrified because the mayor at the base of the mountain wanted the people in the top of the mountain to be out. And so had actually removed electrification from this village. And when word got out that we were going to bring panels up, they put a blockade on the road going up. So it was a roadblock, and they were looking through, making sure that no one was bringing panels up the mountain. And village had a couple horses, and they're like, there is a path on the back of the mountain, and there's no blockade on the back of the mountain. And so this led to this kind of whole complex path of, getting this huge wobbly, literally packed solar panels in a box that was for refrigerators so that it wouldn't attract attention. They came shipped in from China in a big refrigerator box, ended up at the base of the mountain, loaded them into horses. Hmm? Loaded them into horses with some images, which unfortunately we don't see because they're spectacular, um, including schlepping these panels up. There's my wife, Hannah, who at the time was 4 months pregnant, ended up going on top of the horse with the panels up on top. And this is kind of like a characteristic installation, is it's full of a complex mix of humans and technology. And the end result is you apply technology, you do an intervention, people end up happy with it. I don't do this anymore. Um, Around shortly after that particular installation, learned we were going to have a baby. And there's an interesting thing, which is, like this sort of work, you end up going from place to place to place. I think I was living in 3 different countries at once and kind of right on the raggedy edge of existence. And everyone becomes a little bit more conservative when you're going to have a kid. And I started a holographic display company, which is actually based here in Brooklyn, still around. And this is the kid, by the way. She's over there now. Her name is Lumen, um, and has been the center of a lot of light projects throughout her life, and hopefully will continue. So the reason I bring up this kind of backstory is we had started this company, and this company, Looking Glass, it had its headquarters here in Brooklyn. We had offices in Hong Kong and Shenzhen, and I lived in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. So we really had presence in the big 4 cities around the world. And every day I would get on the phone and I would talk to people in each of these locations. And be bouncing back and forth. I'm in New York every week. I'm in Hong Kong every couple months. And I'm constantly involved in the making and production of things. Around, I don't know, say November, December 2020, there started to be a large yikes in these conversations where something was clearly going wrong. And, I'm hearing it from the folks that like I'm talking to in Shenzhen, is people weren't going out, restaurants were closed. Like something was an unusual thing that none of us had seen in our lives. And then we started seeing news like this: ventilators, there's not enough ventilators. And, so this, increases the yikes level. And it kind of raises this question, like I'm reading this and kind of like, well, this is just hype. Like someone has a plan, like at the base of this, like there's a plan for what to do. Like as long as it might not be good, but someone has a plan. And I don't know if any of y'all New Yorkers would tune into Cuomo's like nightly talks at this time, but I remember very vividly this talk where Cuomo said, for out events, we're going to recruit a lot of healthy people to squeeze these bag valve masks. And that's what our hospitals are going to look like. And I was like, oh, that's not a plan. That's really, really bad. And, look, the reason I talk about this design for work in low resource environments, the reason I start that way is because New York is not a low resource environment. It might be the highest resource environment on the planet, except in a pandemic. In a pandemic, literally everywhere is a low resource environment. There is no such thing as high resources in the face of a pandemic. And kind of watching these ideas falling apart. Like, gosh, like this is what we got. We should have something better than this. So moving on, I started, this is probably around January, February 2020. I thought that the right thing to do is to lock myself in a room for like 2 days until I came up with a plan. And I should mention, I don't do medical device design. I don't know anything about medicine. And there's no particular reason why I thought I should make a plan, except that the absence of a plan bothered me. And I kept just seeing everywhere I looked the absence of a plan. And I'm like, I don't know where it's going to come from. It's kind of like the Kitty Genovese thing. Like everyone thinks someone else called the cops. Like just stand up and call the cops. Make a plan, whatever it is. Like if there's a problem, like go and do a thing. And if you're redundant, that's also okay. So I started making kind of like this to-do list for how the plan's going to work. So one is figure out how to make about 500,000 ventilators appear. Um, part two is get into the room where people are like deciding how to move stuff around for a pandemic. And part three is convince everyone in the room that this is a good idea. And then, scale it, like keep making it go until this is solved your problem. This should look like a naive to-do list. If it's not, like, I appreciate your optimism. Uh, um, and something I kind of noticed during a crisis is that this is kind of like new observations for how people work. One was like my state, live in Rhode Island, my state's Department of Health put up this form that's like submit an idea to the Department of Health. And it was just a Google form. And you could type stuff in and never hear anything back. And that was weird. In fact, there was a lot of things that was weird. A lot of these kind of like normal interfaces with large institutions stopped working. Like people stopped responding. They would get overwhelmed or they would get clogged up because business as usual wasn't usual. But this other side of it was neat, which is that you could still call your friends and you could still call people you knew or people you got introduced to, and they would pick up the phone, even if, let's say, a Department of Health would not. Even if, whatever these typical ways that you would approach a larger group, those might not work. But if you knew a person who worked there, that was a way to get in. So you had to kind of learn wayfinding in a whole new way to get stuff out. You had to learn how to navigate along social lines. A couple other things on working in a crisis. So a big one for me was, you could make like 5 devices, but this is a project that was applying to millions and millions of people. Even though I didn't know how to make millions and millions of ventilators, trying to make something that could be deployed at the scale of the problem was key in designing a good intervention here. And then a couple little addendums. So first of all, like the heartwarming thing about COVID, everybody wanted to help. And including like at every level and strata I've ever seen of society, except possibly the leadership. But despite that, like extraordinary things could happen in extraordinarily short amounts of time in a way I've never seen replicated before. Like one example was a weekend project where New York City was trying to figure out how to get like several 100,000 of these oxygen adapters for CPAPs. And we knew we could 3D print them. We didn't know if the medical grade 3D printing was compatible in a pure oxygen environment. And so I called a friend and I was like, do you know, just out of curiosity, I don't know, like how we could do a very detailed chemical test on off-gassing of a device with a device that might cost millions of dollars to see how this works. And my friend's like, yeah, I know a guy. And so I like wrote on a napkin, like this set of tests of like, okay, we want to 3D print some of these things with this finishing process and with this one. And within 24 hours, we had this delightful mass spec results back. It came with a very large bold-faced thing saying do not distribute confidential, and so I confidentially did not distribute it. And as it turns out, a print farm very quickly, like within a couple days, started making these devices. We found there was a practice making them not off gas, and all of a sudden this could very quickly roll out. Again, I'm not normally in the business of writing mass spec tests, but people were willing to ask as long as you could fill in the gaps, like glue together the things that people could easily do with what they have in front of them. So I learned to kind of just ask for a lot of stuff. And I asked for everything from human help to devices to money and everything in between. And then the final thing for me was don't try to make money. Like my goal here was get stuff out the door quickly, like get vents onto lungs. And if I want to do that quick, because this was on a 3 to 4 month time scale that things had to happen, I didn't want to spend time worrying about making money or protecting stuff or wrapping it in layers of confidentiality. The things you would normally do is kind of good business. I wanted to pass through that. And then one final thing was, because of course I don't know anything about medicine, I wanted to convince myself that I was doing some good work. So to try to inform myself about medicine, I reached out along social lines and I said, who can connect me to a pulmonologist who can talk for roughly 8 hours a day for a week? And delightfully, I got connected to a man named Dr. Viral. That is one of my favorite connections of the pandemic. Dr. Viral is a pulmonologist who had just had a 2-week-old baby at this time and was at home and was really happy to have something to do that was relevant to clinical study. He was a sleep medicine pulmonologist, which is different than like critical care pulmonology. And I just began to pepper Dr. Viral with questions and got like a week of intensive instruction in pulmonology. One of the key questions at this time, I also reached out on social lines and ended up in the room that was figuring out how to put ventilators into hospitals. And this room every day would look at things like this, which was a week-by-week forecast distributed by the CDC of when you would run out of ventilators in each state. And this was a really unpleasant way to start your morning. All the meetings were like first thing in the morning. And you wake up and you're like, oh my God, it's all scary. And so this was really like, okay, like we're working on a tight timeline here. And I want to find something that can roll out. Around the same time, for those of you who aren't into vents and pulmonology, just to kind of run through, lots of different types of ventilators. It's a whole spectrum. And we decided early on in the pandemic, when I say we, I mean the WHO, to not use the red flavors of ventilator, which actually meant we lost our most common type of hospital ventilation. And this made everything a lot more complicated. The concern was that we were going to spray viral particles in the air and get our doctors sick. That's a very valid concern. On the other hand, it made it really hard to treat patients. And WHO thinks on both sides of this. I appreciate their concern. This led to people trying to intubate patients very quickly, which had its own sequelae and difficulties. But so, around like March 2020, we see that the US wants about 500,000 ventilators within 3 to 6 months. And having worked in production, we have companies that make ventilators. They can't do it. They have supply lines set up to make vents. They can't do that. We kind of know if they are not going to do it, nobody else can do it. So what can we do with what's already out there? Around this time, like mid-March, Johnny Lee, who's a kind of presence in the open source community, put up a really interesting blog post, taking apart his own CPAP and thinking about what's in it. At a quick show of hands, who here uses a CPAP? CPAPs, woo! So these are sleep apnea machines. They blow a hurricane of air into your mouth while you sleep, and this helps open your airways. It's also the most common respiratory device that's out there. In the last decade, we've put out about 10 million of them across America. And it turns out, I learned from this teardown, that all the blowers in every CPAP and ventilator are the same thing. There's only two manufacturers of them in the world. This was the key bottleneck. This is why we couldn't make more of them. Another thing is CPAPs get replaced by insurance every 4 years. So there's and they have a lifetime of 7 years at a minimum using 8 hours a day. So there's a bunch of CPAPs with useful life sitting on a shelf. In fact, more than 6 times what America needs was just sitting on shelves. So I kind of started figuring out, without a full plan, let's collect them. Now, what's the difference between like a life support vent and a CPAP? I don't know, looking at them. The blower is the same. The pressure sensing is the same. It's got a microcontroller. It's got some hose connectors. It's kind of the same thing. And I actually started going through these and saying, well, what is the difference between a home use sleep apnea machine and a life support vent? And there isn't a technical difference, with one key exception, which is an alarm if it gets disconnected, is the difference between a life support vent and a home use one. So real quick, if you go to business school and someone's like, hey, you're going to run a company and you're going to make some products, they're going to tell you you should sell 3 products in a product line: a beginner, an intermediate, and a pro, and you should charge more for each one. They're also going to tell you it's a big pain in the butt to make 3 different things. So you make one thing and you cripple it in firmware. So the nice term for this is market segmentation. But what I kind of was starting to guess was you could write a firmware that would let this basic thing work like a fancy thing. We'll skip through this. So this question was on my mind, and I reached out on social lines to the guy who is the largest distributor of CPAPs in the world. His name is Johnny. And I started asking for every model of CPAP that he could send me. And think about firmware and reverse engineering firmware. I got connected to another guy who is a particularly capable firmware reverse engineer. And I started firing every model of CPAP over to him in Amsterdam and saying, can you write a program that instead of just blowing a constant stream of air, starts to flip it off and on? This is the basics between we call a continuous positive airway pressure and a bi-level positive airway pressure, which mimics breaths. And within 24 hours, he came back. He said, well, I could, but I don't have to because it's already on there. So people, of course, had written 3 different firmwares, each of these device manufacturers, and put all 3 through FDA on each device so that you could just flip one bit that said, I'm a BiPAP, I'm a BiPAP ST, I'm a CPAP. And depending on whatever you said, even though it wasn't in the right box, it would behave like the different flavor of device. At this point, I got really excited. I started running around like a Muppet, like with my arms like waving around, and trying to figure out what this meant. This is an open source project. It's called Airbrake. You can reflash your own ones. They work great. And it just opens up these other levels, kind of like Magic Lantern, for any of you who are familiar with camera hacking. So yeah, I mean, even though these are not consumer devices, they follow the same capitalism logic that everything else does. And then this other interesting thing happens. As soon as you say the word firmware out loud in medicine, people's eyes do that thing that sharks' eyes do when they're about to attack you, where like the nictitating membrane comes in and like just turns milky white, and you're like, I'm about to get bit. Like something happened. I don't know what it is, but something bad happened. And this question of how do you certify a device that has the same firmware that the manufacturer put on, but you just switched which one is running, is a thorny medical question. It is a difficult one, even in the face where this is a clear positive. That is a difficult question. So this one I actually left. This particular insight, I said, this is an open source project. I collected a bunch of CPAPs. And when it came to getting them into hospitals, I said, I'm going to get the unmodified ones in because that is faster. This will add 6 months of questionable timeline. And right now I want to get a lot of devices into hospitals. So running through these, I said, all right, I'm a little bit sore about that. I think it's annoying. I wish you could get more capable devices in. I found this frustrating, but what are you going to do? We quickly started throwing up this little box, which my friend Liam made, and just like padlocked to the outside of my building in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And then we somehow convinced the state to broadcast they drop off your CPAPs thing. Shortly after that, the state got shamed into giving us a truck and letting us donate them in every fire station in the state. And then they got shamed a little more into giving me the University of Rhode Island and 150 grad students to make a CPAP reprocessing facility that respiratory techs would teach people how to collect and refurbish CPAPs. We started getting these trucks that would come in. People started bringing in huge amounts of these devices. We started collecting them like crazy. At this point, we had like, wads of devices on a table, but it didn't look like a thing. So this is where the reason we live in Rhode Island, and I went to RISD, all of our friends are artists. And artists, what good are a bunch of artists in a pandemic? Well, this wasn't a technology problem. This was an art problem, or as engineers like to call art, documentation problem. And this was the documentation problem. This is my Sharpie drawing. And if I showed this to a doctor, they would like take a sip of coffee and just. So good news is you can give this to a good artist, and all of a sudden it looks like a medical device, because it is a medical device. You just have to make it look the part, okay? And this is an interesting thing. Another common thing with a home use device is you got to be able to fiddle with the settings. Every pulmonologist says, every res tech has to do this. And on a home device, they are hidden because there is some amount of distrust for users to adjust their own settings. So each one has a secret cheat code, like AA, BA, up, down, start, where if you hold down stuff for a certain number of seconds, you get into the secret menu and you can adjust it. So printing and laminating ID cards for every model of CPAP in existence and putting them into their boxes became a key part of getting these usable in hospitals. So how do they get into hospitals? Well, you kind of got to make them into a product, because pandemic or not, we buy into a product, a thing with a predictable box and an instruction guide. And so we put in this stuff, including this thing, which is a helmet that you put over your head, which lets you filter the air coming out from getting into your healthcare workers' lungs. We figured out how to get all this stuff. We got a lot of it. And we started putting it into boxes. And around this time, I was obsessed with this one question of, this is about to get used. Like, all these are going out the door. I could have just let them go out the door and let doctors deal with this. And I'm not super smart. This paper was bothering me, which said, these were results of invasive ventilation in Wuhan. And there was a similar story in Lombardy and a similar story in New York. Invasive ventilation in New York had about a 12% survival rate. This was a last resort. And it did not have it was a huge use of resources. You have to do this in an ICU. It's a life support setting. And it wasn't really paying off necessarily. You could throw all your resources at it, but it wasn't a good outcome for most patients. And again, I mentioned this thing of, in a pandemic, every place is a low resource setting. And even if you can get more stuff, you don't have more ICU doctors, you don't have more ICU nurses, you don't have people who are in this constantly, who are super trained. And so just having ventilators doesn't make everything turn out okay. It's a last resort. It's important to have it, but it's not the thing you want to use on everybody. And we saw this, we learned this, unfortunately, in each country relearned this lesson for themselves. And it raised a second question. So this is around May 2020. This didn't work great in New York. What's it going to look like everywhere else? How can you make this useful when your healthcare system is under strain? And this led to kind of the final iteration of this, which we called circumvent. Get it? Dr. Fred Allen was very proud of that title. So this was an idea of how do you use these low-end ventilators for people who are mildly or moderately ill rather than severely ill to avoid them getting worse. If you had a limitless amount of these devices, which you can, how do you deploy them in a sensible way? And we, at some point around this time, we're asking everybody, can we get like $7,000 to send like a couple pallets to this place, like wherever it was? We said, we have all these devices, they're free, we just need shipping. And at some point we approached the CDC Foundation, who said, no, we don't fund untested interventions. We said, but this is a device, it's already throughout the day, let's go. And they said, no one has tested this in a global respiratory pandemic. And I was like, and they said, well, we do fund studies. We said, oh, a good study would be, if you had a lot of ventilators, would it help? And so this began our largest intervention, which was running the ventilation program for the entire country of Nigeria and working with every COVID ventilation center in the country, training about 300 respiratory staff. This is our best documented and studied intervention. We worked in 26 countries, but this is when we got data from and built the infrastructure to hear back. And there's a whole bunch of stuff I'm going to skip through real quick. But point is this. Look, we have data. Sometimes I look at it and I think about, did this help? Was this a worthwhile thing? And the answer is yeah. A lot of people were put on our vents that got better on our vents. And I know I can't say what would happen if the vent wasn't there because this wasn't a double-blind study. But I can say it probably wouldn't have been there if we hadn't sent stuff. This is true in a lot of different healthcare systems. So I'm very glad that we had the opportunity to put stuff out. This is the CPAP shed at this time. Around 2022, we turned into the chicken feed shed in the back of our house. This is Lumen digging some kind of hole. And I'm very happy to kind of put this project to rest. This was a single purpose organization that was designed during the crisis part of COVID. Don't really need to be doing vents anymore. This is a fine thing to have done. I'm very happy we did it. I'm very happy to put it to rest. And for the huge number, it's about 175 people who helped organize and work this. I'm extremely thankful, but above all else to those two over there. So thanks for your time.